The fluorescent lights of Aegis Capital had a way of flattening everything, turning six-figure salaries and high-stakes financial decisions into a dull, humdrum blur. I sat at my desk, rubbing my temples, looking at the spreadsheet that represented our firm's risk compliance map. I was 48 years old, with over 2 decades of financial oversight under my belt, and yet I felt like a parent trying to explain to toddlers why they could not eat the crayons. In this case, the toddlers wore designer suits and the crayons were federal regulations. To my right sat a lukewarm cup of coffee, and to my left was a massive textbook on administrative law. For the past 3 years, I had been spending 3 nights a week dragging myself to the local university for an evening Master of Business Administration. I did not do it to climb the ladder at Aegis. I did it because I could see the cracks in the foundation of this place, and I wanted a solid exit ramp when the inevitable collapse came. I spent hours reading case law and studying regulatory trends, preparing for the day when my expertise would be my only leverage. I did not want to get swept away when they failed. I had spent years in the quiet purgatory of corporate compliance. It is a thankless corner of the financial world. When you do your job perfectly, nothing happens, which leads the executives to believe you are a useless expense. When something goes wrong, they ask why you did not stop it. I was the person who had to explain to our senior vice president of operations, Eleanor Thorne, why she could not simply delete disclosure slides from our client presentations to make the sales pitch feel more optimistic. She would sigh, adjust her gold bracelets, and ask if we could just hide the regulatory warnings in a footnote. I would tell her no because it was a direct violation of our fiduciary duty to our clients, and she would walk away, leaving a trail of expensive perfume and resentment. Aegis Capital managed over $700 million in assets, and yet the leadership team operated as if they were running a local lemonade stand rather than a regulated investment firm. They wanted all of the prestige that came with managing client wealth, but none of the operational discipline required to protect it. The corporate ecosystem shifted when our chief executive officer, Margaret Sinclair, decided to hire Oliver Thorne as our new head of workplace culture. Oliver was Eleanor's husband. He was a man whose entire resume seemed to consist of running team-building retreats and writing corporate mantras on glass walls. He had no legal background, no understanding of financial audits, and yet he was given an office right next to mine. Within his first week, Oliver began attending my compliance meetings. He would sit at the table, wearing pastel sweaters, and ask if we could make our internal audit procedures feel more intuitive. He once suggested that we should replace our annual regulatory training with a series of guided meditations on personal integrity. I tried to explain that the Securities and Exchange Commission did not accept mindfulness as a substitute for signed documentation, but he simply smiled and told the room that my attachment to rules was a trauma response to legalese. He believed that everything could be solved with a positive attitude and a few colorful graphics. Eleanor supported her husband's ideas completely. Together, they began to systematically bypass my office. They approved new marketing campaigns that made unregistered performance claims, and they ignored my written warnings about proper client account segmentation. I spent my evenings correcting their documentation errors and pulling long hours to ensure we remained within the boundaries of the law, all while balancing my intensive evening MBA coursework. I would sit in the corner booth of a half-lit diner, eating a dry sandwich, studying corporate finance and liability structures, knowing that the knowledge I was gaining would soon be my only shield. I watched them take my risk projections and present them to the board of directors as their own collective insights, never offering a word of appreciation. I did not complain. In my line of work, you learn to let the paper trail do the talking, and I was keeping a very detailed record of every conversation. I knew that in the financial industry, a single undocumented conversation could be the difference between safety and a federal investigation. The tension reached a boiling point at the annual spring gala. The event was held in the courtyard of a boutique downtown hotel under string lights with a classical quartet playing in the background. I was standing near the edge of the crowd, holding a club soda, preparing for a final exam on corporate law that was scheduled for the next morning. Oliver floated over, his silk jacket catching the light, accompanied by several junior analysts. He noticed the textbook in my briefcase and decided to make a show of it. He announced to the group, in a voice loud enough to carry across the courtyard, that my evening studies were quaint but highly unprofessional. He suggested that Aegis Capital needed professionals who were fully focused on the firm's growth rather than people wasting their energy on night school projects. Eleanor stood beside him, nodding in agreement, while the junior analysts laughed politely to please their superiors. I did not argue. I simply looked at their smug faces, took a sip of my water, and realized that my departure from Aegis was no longer a plan for the future. It was a necessity for the present. I walked away, feeling the cool night air, ready to close this chapter. I knew that their arrogance was their vulnerability, and that they had no idea what was about to happen next. I was prepared for the storm, and I had already built my foundation. The next morning, the corporate trap was sprung exactly as I anticipated. At 9 in the morning, I was summoned to the Human Resources Department. The Director of Human Resources, Audrey, sat behind her desk, wearing a practiced expression of sympathy that did not reach her eyes. She spoke in soft, measured tones about a growing misalignment between my work style and the firm's new culture. She explained that while my technical skills were undeniable, my constant objections were creating a negative friction within the leadership team. She did not use the word termination. Instead, she presented a thick separation agreement, offering me 3 months of severance pay in exchange for a full release of claims and a strict non-disclosure agreement. They wanted a quiet exit, a clean way to remove the only person who insisted on following the rules. I leaned back in my chair, looking at the document. It was a standard corporate separation template, one that I had actually helped the legal department draft 3 years ago when the firm was updating its exit procedures. I recognized the boilerplate clauses and the standard terminology. I asked a single direct question: who would be taking over my responsibilities as the Chief Compliance Officer? Audrey smiled nervously and told me that the legal department would delegate the daily tasks and that Oliver Thorne was very excited to oversee our internal compliance frameworks to ensure they aligned with our corporate values. It was a staggering display of ignorance. They truly believed that compliance was just a corporate title, a hat that could be worn by anyone, rather than a federally registered position carrying personal legal liability. They did not realize that a registered investment advisor must have a designated, qualified individual on file with the regulators at all times. They treated this requirement as if it were a simple box to check, rather than a critical regulatory mandate that protects client assets. They had no understanding of the compliance infrastructure that I had spent years building and maintaining. I did not sign the agreement. I told her I would take the packet home to review it with my legal counsel. I walked back to my office, packed my personal belongings, my father's old desk clock, my study materials, and my notebook, and placed them in a cardboard box. I sat at my computer and drafted a brief, formal resignation email. I addressed it to the chief executive, Margaret Sinclair, the legal department, and human resources. I wrote that I was resigning from my position as chief compliance officer effective immediately, and that I had returned all company equipment. I specifically included a line advising them to immediately file the necessary form update with the Securities and Exchange Commission to reflect my departure. I sent the message, walked to the front desk, handed my security badge and laptop to the receptionist, Chloe, and walked out into the morning sun. I walked 3 blocks to a quiet diner, ordered breakfast, and opened my personal laptop. I felt a profound sense of relief. For years, I had been the thin line preventing Aegis Capital from crossing into regulatory disaster, and they had rewarded me by calling my dedication unprofessional. What they did not understand was that by accepting my immediate resignation, they had entered a legal minefield. I was no longer their shield, and the clock was ticking. If they submitted any official filings using my name or credentials after my departure, they would be committing a federal offense. I turned my attention to my master's thesis, typing the first sentences of a chapter on executive liability and administrative failure. I was finally free, and Aegis Capital was completely on its own. I spent the afternoon at the library, surrounded by the quiet rustle of pages and the hum of laptops. It was a refreshing contrast to the high-pressure atmosphere of Aegis Capital. I realized that my decision to pursue the business degree was the best choice I had made in a long time. It gave me the credentials and the confidence to walk away from a toxic environment. I spent several hours reviewing case studies of corporate governance failures, noting how often executive hubris led to administrative collapse. It was a pattern I had seen play out in real time, and I was determined to use my experience to help other firms avoid the same pitfalls. I was no longer just a compliance officer. I was a scholar of corporate behavior. Preparing for a new chapter in my career, I sat in the library cafe, sipping a warm tea, watching the rain tap against the large glass windows. I thought about the files I had left behind, all carefully organized and labeled. I had spent 6 years of my life maintaining those records, ensuring that every transaction was documented and every rule was respected. I knew that without my guidance, the firm would quickly lose its way. The executives had always treated my department as an administrative hurdle rather than a necessary safeguard. They would soon learn that compliance was not a decoration, but the very foundation of their business. I felt a quiet satisfaction knowing that I had done my duty and that whatever happened next was their own responsibility. I opened my notebook and continued to write, my thoughts clear and focused on the future. I knew that the storm was coming, and I had already found my shelter. I felt a sense of excitement about the opportunities that lay ahead, free from corporate constraints. The crisis at Aegis Capital began less than 24 hours after my departure. The firm was facing a hard federal deadline for their quarterly assets under management update, a critical filing that required the signature of the registered chief compliance officer. Without my login credentials and without a registered replacement, the legal department was locked out of the regulatory portal. Rather than reporting the vacancy to the regulators and requesting an extension, Eleanor Thorne made the disastrous decision to bypass the system. She instructed a junior staff member to use my saved login details to access the portal. They updated the asset figures, post-dated the submission to make it appear as though it had been authorized during my tenure, and electronically signed my name to the federal document. It was a desperate move, driven by panic and a complete ignorance of the security protocols that protect federal filings. They believed they had solved the problem, thinking they could quietly update the personal registry during the next routine filing cycle. It was a fatal mistake. By submitting a false federal document and signing the name of a resigned employee, they had committed a direct violation of California Penal Code Section 470, which covers the forgery of electronic signatures. Under the law, the entire filing was void ab initio, meaning it had no legal standing from the moment it was submitted. Furthermore, they had actively misrepresented the firm's regulatory oversight to their investors, creating a massive breach of fiduciary duty. At 9 the following morning, the consequences of their arrogance arrived. Agent Henry Campbell, a seasoned auditor from the regional office of the Securities and Exchange Commission, walked into the lobby of Aegis Capital. He was conducting a surprise compliance review, a standard procedure that became an emergency the moment he approached the reception desk. He showed his credentials to Chloe and asked to speak with Julian Vance, the registered chief compliance officer. Chloe, unaware of the legal implications, told him that I had resigned 2 days prior and no longer worked at the firm. Agent Campbell did not blink. He simply noted her response in his binder and requested an immediate meeting with the chief executive officer. Margaret Sinclair was pulled from a presentation with our largest institutional clients. When she entered the boardroom, she attempted to dismiss the issue as a simple administrative delay, claiming that the firm was undergoing a standard transition. Agent Campbell was entirely unmoved. He pulled up the regulatory database on his screen and showed her the filing that had been submitted under my name just hours earlier. He asked how a resigned employee could have authorized a federal disclosure. Margaret looked at the document, and the color drained from her face. Her hand began to tremble as she realized the legal trap they had sprung on themselves. They had filed a false report under my name, and they had no registered officer to defend them during a federal audit. The boardroom was silent, save for the soft hum of the projector. The executives sat in their leather chairs, unable to meet the auditor's gaze. Margaret tried to explain that it was an administrative oversight, a temporary lag in their system update. But Agent Campbell was not interested in excuses. He pointed out that the document had been signed electronically using my personal credentials, hours after my resignation had been logged by the Human Resources Department. It was a clear case of unauthorized access and regulatory misrepresentation. The firm's credibility was shattered in a single moment, and the legal department was left scrambling to find a defense that did not exist. Eleanor Thorne attempted to intervene, suggesting that the filing was technically accurate even if the signature was administrative. Agent Campbell turned his cool gaze toward her, explaining that the federal government does not accept forged signatures on official documents, regardless of the numbers contained within them. He noted that the use of a former employee's credentials to bypass regulatory restrictions was a serious matter that would be referred to the Enforcement Division. The legal counsel in the room looked down at their notebooks, realizing that any attempt to defend the action would only make the situation worse. The corporate charm that had worked so well on investors was completely useless against the quiet authority of a federal investigator. Agent Campbell sat in the large boardroom of Aegis Capital, flipping through the printout of the regulatory filing. He compared the timestamp on the electronic signature, which showed 9:15 that morning, with a copy of the resignation notice that was timestamped at 5 o'clock 2 days earlier. He noted the discrepancy in his notebook. He asked the legal team if they could show him the email communications between my department and the executive committee. Margaret Sinclair tried to divert his attention, offering to show him their client satisfaction metrics. But Agent Campbell was focused entirely on the timeline. He asked how a person who was no longer an employee could have accessed the firm's secure regulatory portal. The legal counsel remained silent, knowing that the answer was that they had committed a federal offense. The air in the boardroom was thick with tension, and the executives realized that their attempts to spin the narrative were failing. They had no answers for the investigator, and the silence in the room was deafening. They were trapped by their own actions, and they knew it. The panic within the executive suites of Aegis Capital was absolute. The legal team quickly realized that they could not undo the filing without admitting to the forgery. The firm was now in direct violation of Rule 20647 of the Investment Advisors Act, which mandates that every registered investment advisor must maintain an active, qualified chief compliance officer to oversee operations. Without a valid officer on file, their regulatory registration was in jeopardy, which meant they could be legally barred from managing client funds. This would trigger an automatic default in their client contracts, allowing their largest investors to withdraw their capital immediately. That afternoon, I received a phone call from the senior partner of the external law firm representing Aegis Capital. His tone was desperate, stripped of the usual corporate polish. He offered me an immediate consulting contract, promising $10,000 a week for a minimum of 4 weeks, to assist them with the audit and to retroactively ratify the quarterly filing. He told me I could work entirely from my home and that the firm would cover the remaining costs of my master's degree. I listened quietly, writing his points down on a yellow notepad, and then refused. I reminded him that I had resigned in writing and had explicitly warned the executive team to update their regulatory status. I told him I would not sign my name to a false filing, nor would I assist in covering up their negligence. I hung up the phone and contacted my own attorney, Dalton, to discuss my options. I refused to let their desperation compromise my values or endanger the career I had built over 20 years. I knew that once you compromise your integrity in this business, you can never get it back. I had spent my final months at Aegis Capital, keeping a meticulous record of every compliance warning I had issued. I had saved emails, meeting minutes, and internal memos documenting how Eleanor Thorne had repeatedly ignored my flags regarding client account segmentation and how Margaret Sinclair had approved marketing materials containing unverified performance data. I compiled these documents into a comprehensive file, That evening, I submitted the entire package to the regulatory authorities through the official whistleblower portal. I was not seeking revenge. I was protecting my professional reputation and ensuring that the public record reflected the truth. Under federal whistleblower protections, my submission was secure, and the evidence was irrefutable. Dalton confirmed that my documentation was solid and that my immediate resignation had insulated me from the firm's subsequent actions. He advised me to remain silent and let the regulatory process take its course. He pointed out that their attempt to offer me a contract was a clear indication of their vulnerability. They were trying to buy my silence, but I was not interested in their money. I had worked too hard to build my reputation to throw it away for a short-term payout. I felt a sense of pride as I closed my folder. I had followed the law, and now the law would do its work. I sat in my study, looking at the screen of my computer. The portal had accepted my submission, and I received an automated confirmation code. It was a simple sequence of letters, but it represented the end of a long struggle. For years, I had been forced to compromise, to negotiate, and to plead with people who did not respect the law. Now, the roles were reversed. The executives who had mocked my evening studies were scrambling to find a way to save their careers, while I sat in the comfort of my home, preparing for my exams. I turned off my monitor, stood up, and went to make dinner. The weight of Aegis Capital was finally off my shoulders, and I felt a deep, quiet peace. I knew that my files were secure, and that the regulators had everything they needed. My attorney, Dalton, had assured me that my actions were protected under federal law, and that I was completely clear of any liability for their actions. I could focus on my final semester of night school, knowing that my future was secure and that my integrity remained intact. Dalton explained that by reporting the violations immediately, I had established a clear record of my compliance recommendations. This would prevent the firm from trying to claim that I had approved the questionable transactions. He pointed out that their attempt to offer me a contract was a clear indication of their vulnerability. They were trying to buy my silence, but I was not interested in their money. I had worked too hard to build my reputation to throw it away for a short-term payout. I felt a sense of pride as I closed my folder. I had followed the law, and now the law would do its work. I was finally in a position of strength, and I did not intend to yield. I knew that my files were secure and that the regulators had everything they needed. My attorney had assured me that my actions were protected under federal law and that I was completely clear of any liability for their subsequent actions. I had done my job, and now the system would take care of the rest. I had done my duty to my profession and to myself, and I was ready for whatever consequences followed for Aegis Capital. The resolution of the crisis was swift and devastating for Aegis Capital. The regulatory agency opened a formal investigation into the firm for reporting fraud and identity misrepresentation. The news broke in the financial media, and the firm's stock price plunged 20% within 48 hours. Aegis Capital's largest institutional clients, representing hundreds of millions of dollars in assets, filed immediate withdrawal notices, citing a material breach of fiduciary duty. The board of directors held an emergency meeting, terminating Eleanor and Oliver Thorne immediately. Margaret Sinclair was removed from her role as chief executive officer and faced a permanent ban from the financial services industry. I completed my Master of Business Administration 3 months later. My capstone project, titled Executive Negligence and the Collapse of Aegis Capital, was awarded the department's highest academic honor. I was invited to present my findings at a national conference on financial compliance, where I explained that a company's internal culture is meaningless if it is built on a disregard for the law. My former employers had believed that compliance was an unnecessary obstacle to their growth. But they learned that without it, their growth was nothing but an illusion. They had built their entire empire on a foundation of cutting corners and ignoring regulations, and in the end, it was their own hubris that brought them down. They had forgotten that in the financial world, integrity is the only currency that truly matters over the long term. Today, I run my own independent consulting firm, advising corporate boards on regulatory structure and ethical oversight. I no longer have to explain to arrogant executives why the rules apply to them. I have my degree, my professional standing, and the peace of mind that comes from knowing I chose integrity over corporate convenience. Aegis Capital's glass offices are now mostly empty, a silent monument to the danger of executive hubris. Justice was not delivered with shouting, but with the quiet authority of a documented paper trail. I sat in my new office, looking out at the city skyline. The desk was clean, free of the cluttered folders that had defined my time at Aegis Capital. I had a new client meeting scheduled for the afternoon, a firm that genuinely valued my expertise and wanted to build a robust compliance program from the ground up. It was a satisfying feeling, knowing that my work was now respected. I realized that the collapse of my former company was a tragedy, but it was also a powerful lesson for the entire industry. I was proud to have played a role in bringing the truth to light, and I was ready to help others build a better future. The phone on my desk rang, and I picked it up. It was a board member from a large regional bank asking if I would be available to conduct an independent review of their compliance systems. They had read my published case study and wanted to ensure their own policies were up to standard. I smiled, checked my calendar, and agreed to schedule a meeting. As I hung up, I felt a quiet satisfaction. The credentials I had worked so hard to earn during those long night classes were now my greatest asset. I had built a new career on the foundation of my own values, and I was ready for whatever came next. The truth had won, and I was moving forward. During my presentation at the national conference, I looked out at the audience and saw many young professionals who were just starting their careers in corporate compliance. I could see the same mixture of dedication and anxiety in their eyes that I had felt for so many years. I decided to deviate from my slides and speak to them directly. I told them that their professional reputation was their most valuable asset, and that they should never let any executive pressure them into compromising their values. I explained that a firm's internal culture is only as strong as its commitment to the law, and that when that commitment fails, the collapse is inevitable. The response from the audience was overwhelming. Several students came up to me after the presentation to ask for advice on how to handle difficult situations in their own workplaces. I spent over an hour talking with them, sharing my experiences and offering support. It was a rewarding experience, and it confirmed that my decision to write the capstone project and speak out was the right one. I was no longer just a compliance officer who had walked away. I was a mentor and a guide for the next generation of financial leaders. I stood up, walked to the window, and watched the busy streets below us. The city was full of firms, all trying to navigate the complex world of modern finance. Many of them would try to cut corners, believing that they were too smart to get caught. But they would eventually learn, just as Aegis Capital did, that the rules are not optional. I was ready to help those who wanted to do things right, and I was content knowing that my own path was clear. I had chosen the long, difficult road of education and integrity, and it had led me to a place of genuine success. I was finally where I belonged. The quiet office around me was a testament to the fact that when you stand on solid ground, you do not have to worry about the storms. I was at peace, knowing that I had built my life on the truth. I knew that I had made the right decision and that my story would help others choose the path of integrity.